today we are going to discuss the problem of privatization in India. This very term was not considered a very good term. Some people said that this is a dirty term, and nobody talked about privatization during 1970s. However, from 1980 onwards, we are hearing about this term, and particularly after July 1991, this term has got a very wide currency. Even in academic field, in business, in politics, everywhere we hear the term today, privatization. If everything going wrong in public sector, people immediately say, why is it not privatized? This means that people see that privatization will bring some kind of efficiency in the system. But the question here is that India is having a mixed economy where there is coexistence of both public sector and private sector. When public sector was started immediately after independence, it was thought that it will make the progress very rapid, it will make the progress equitable as well. But our experience has been a mixed one. Even today, there are public sector enterprises which are functioning very well, and there is no debate about that. But the question today that a state does not want to do certain activities, and as a result of that, people say that this should be transferred to the private sector. In this course, what we have found that the very mixture of mixed economy is undergoing a change in India. In this context, today we will discuss the various aspects of privatization, whether it suits our economy, and if suits, then to what extent. In this context, I am having two experts here to discuss the very topic of privatization. The first guest whom I am introducing to you is Professor Rudir Dutt, who was director of the School of Correspondence Courses of Delhi University for about 30 years. He actually was the first person to start an academic discussion on the topic of privatization in his presidential address of All India Economic Association at Anantapur, perhaps in the year 1991. So this topic actually started discussion, and his lecture was appreciated by number of scholars in this field. So I hope he will be throw further light for our benefit on this particular topic. Our next guest today is Professor P.D. Hazela, who has been Vice Chancellor of number of universities in India, and he has taught at the University of Allahabad as Professor of Economics. He has a long experience in the field. So these two speakers today will throw light on the privatization debate. First of all, I request Professor Dutt to say something about public sector, how it started and how the performance of public sector led to dissatisfaction among academics as well as to general public.
Professor Singh, you are very right when you said that public sector we adopted after independence with the hope of accelerating economic development. And we were finding that there were certain deficiencies in our economy. And the most important deficiency was the absence of infrastructure or weak development of infrastructure. And in certain areas it was practically non-existent. And it was with this end in view that we went ahead with public sector as the engine of growth. Because at that time we found that the private sector was not in a position to undertake investments. For instance, the Tatas were asked, will you be able to set up another steel plant or take up a hydroelectric project? But at that time they said, no, we cannot take it up. Therefore, the private sector was not in a position to undertake what may be described as lumpy investment. And it was with this end in view that the government said, let us take the initiative and let us start the public sector undertakings. Therefore, public sector became the engine of growth. And in a number of areas, for instance, Jawaharlal Nehru described the hydroelectric projects as the temples of modern India. What did he mean? We didn't have enough of electric energy, we didn't have enough of irrigation facilities, and these projects, they were the harbingers of bringing electric energy, irrigation benefits, and so he described them as the temples of modern India because they were providing a lot of sustenance to people, they were helping in raising agricultural productivity, they were helping the process of industrialization because, without electricity you can't carry on industrialization. Similarly, road building had to be undertaken, the country had to be connected, the remote areas had to be connected. And unless you connect them, you will not enlarge the market. Therefore, we thought this aspect should also be attended to. Then we had very little production of steel, only one steel plant of the Tatas for the entire country. That was totally insufficient. Therefore, we thought of steel plants. We had no locomotives factory, we had no aircraft building manufacture, we had no defense industries. And so, there were areas which were totally eclipsed by the British and were denied any foothold in India. And it was with this intention that the public sector was projected to develop what is described as the capital goods sector in the country.
But, sir, public sector industries, of course, they started with building infrastructural aspects of the economy, but in due course is spread to consumer goods industry also.
Yes.
Now, will Professor Rizala say something?
Well, I think the spread to the consumer goods sector was marginal. There has been too much fuss made about it, actually. In one case, for example, the textiles. They went over to textiles because the industry was not able to look to the interests of the workers well. That was also a consideration, therefore. But I wouldn't think that by and large, of the total investment made in this country over the years, more than 20% or even more than 15% was actually devoted to the consumer goods sector, so far as the public sector is concerned.
Even less, I think.
Yeah.
Even less.
So it was more a propaganda point made against the public sector, less substantial point.
But, sir, the point here is that there are group of people, experts, vested interest, who all the time saying something against public sector. They do not see the positive and the distributive aspect or the role.
Such people will always be there.
Yes.
In fact, the number is increasing among the elitist classes.
To my mind, the public sector in India is also an instrument of achieving some kind of social objectives. And
That's what I was trying to argue.
Yes.
If I put it in economic terms,
Yes.
what was desired at that time was that investment, because of limited resources, should be prioritized. And the first priority is the infrastructure and the capital goods, so that elasticity in respect to the output of the rest of the economy can expand.
That's why we say commanding heights of the economy
That's right.
should be in the public sector.
That's
now the question is that what has been our experience regarding the working of these public sector enterprises? Professor, what will you say?
The experience has been rather mixed. And there are public sector units which are very, very efficiently run. On the other extreme, there are public sector units which are very inefficiently run. Therefore, to paint all public sector units with a black brush, that is totally wrong.
Yes.
But there is a vested interest which has always been trying to malign the public sector.
Now I am interested here to know something about the positive aspects of public sector in India.
For instance, we have been able to generate a lot of electric energy. We had started from scratch, and today we are having an installed capacity of 460 billion kilowatts, and about 95% is contributed by the public sector. And without electric energy, no industrialization is possible. That's a positive achievement.
Not merely that, if I may add. One of the objectives of Indian economic policy, right from the beginning, was self-reliance.
Yes.
And in fact, everyone has conceded that if there was one goal of economic policy which was achieved in this country, it was that of economic self-reliance. In the sense that whereas earlier, in respect of 90% of our products, we were importing, now, in respect of 90% of the projects, we are self-sufficient.
So this is one of the positive aspects.
One of the very positive, because it's diversified the entire industrial structure in the country.
Take another aspect. Unless you expand irrigation, you can't improve productivity. Therefore, the moment we went on expanding irrigation, productivity went up. Green revolution is the product of the benefits that the public sector gave in irrigated areas. The result is we are totally self-sufficient in food. And now we are talking of exporting agricultural products. Agriculture should also undertake this year. Only in mangoes we will be earning 500 crores of rupees of foreign exchange. Now you see, these are certain developments which could be made possible by the positive contribution of the public sector. There are very many areas. We had no idea of building locomotives, rolling stock, other things, which we have now. We have now defense industries, and one of the things that has come out is that since we have our own defense production, we are much better placed than as compared to our neighbor Pakistan or Burma or some other countries. So that is an achievement, that we can build equipment to defend ourselves also.
Yes, sir. The point here is that there are certain positive contribution of public sector enterprises in terms of building infrastructure, in providing a base for industrial development of the country. Whatever growth that we are seeing today in private sector, the credit goes to the public sector because it has provided infrastructural base everywhere in the economy. Whether you take industry, whether you take services sector, transport, or whether you take agriculture. So these are the very positive contribution of the functioning of public sector enterprises in India. But sir, despite all these positive aspects, there is a question regarding pricing of product of public sector product. Maybe in the services sector or maybe in the industry sector. Now, will Professor Hazela say something about this pricing aspect? Because this is very much criticized, this is related to subsidies. So you please throw some light on
this. There are a
this.
few factors which complicate the price situation so far as the public sector is concerned. A, the public sector is not a private sector. Therefore, it fixes the price, which need not necessarily be cost plus. It is quite possible that it is using the price mechanism as an instrument for economic welfare of the people, particularly the poorer people. This is point one. Point two, which is of course something which needs to be pondered over seriously, the public sector tends to be monopolistic in character. And when there is a monopolist tendency, inefficiency sets in, there is no competition. Therefore, innovation, raising of productivity, improvement of efficiency, which are all tagged on to the competitive ethos in the economy, that becomes absent from the public sector. That raises the price level in an indirect manner. So, even though it may be justified to lower prices in order to benefit certain categories of people, because after all, the public sector infrastructure is intended primarily to provide external economies to the people at large, particularly the private sector, and everybody in fact. And when you are thinking of external economies being provided through infrastructure, which is a very legitimate demand in a developing economy, then it is very clear that you have to see to it that the costs, particularly the price mechanism, which you use for building up the prices of infrastructure, is not such as to bring down the raise the transaction costs of the economy. Higher the transaction costs of the economy, more inimical that infrastructure becomes to the growth of the economy in the long period. So because of these difficulties, lack of competitive capacity, and then the insistence on fixing a price mechanism which is conducive to the welfare of the people, the public sector is caught in a dilemma. And that is where it has failed. And it has not been able to resolve the dilemma appropriately.
So it would also be important to understand the public sector bosses are not independent in fixing their prices. For every increase of price or revision of price, they have to make a case. And the case has to be put up to the minister. And then there are considerations which are more political in nature. And sometimes what happens is that the political considerations do not allow the public sector units to rationalize prices. Therefore, to some extent, the political factor has been operating to restrict the bosses. That is why today we are talking, give the public sector autonomy in functioning. And this functional autonomy also implies that they should try to fix prices on the basis of costs, and other considerations may not be there. But the problem is, for instance, take the state electricity boards. Now, state electricity boards, the costs are much higher. In certain areas, the cost of electricity production is 2 rupees per kilowatt. But even then, a recommendation was made that charge a minimum of 50 paise. The political bosses do not allow this because there are lobbies which are functioning. Therefore, to hold the public sector bosses, managers responsible for inefficiency would be partly incorrect.
Now, in this context, what you have said is perfectly all right. The point here is that we have to make certain distinction.
Right.
As you have said that the public sector enterprises do not have the kind of autonomy which a private sector firm is having so far as price of the product is concerned. There is political element. Whenever we say public sector, some amount of politics will always be there because government as an owner. Now, in this context, you have rightly pointed out that the persons manning the public sector enterprises, they are all right. Their technical efficiency is all right. They are failing because of political and some kind of bureaucratic interference is taking place. Besides this, one must also consider that, and as Professor Hazila has pointed out, that government is not in a position to run the enterprise as a private sector firm does, because here the larger social good is to be taken into account. But despite all these things, whenever we talk of reform of the public sector enterprises, and government is also talking today of reforming public sector enterprises, my point here is that what should be the relationship between ownership and the management? Because here government as an owner, so if government is an owner, that creates its own problem. Now, there is a talk that ownership can be separated and management should be given to someone. Here, I wish to have some enlightenment from both of you as to what reform you will suggest for public sector enterprises. Here I would like to make it clear, we are clear about that, but for the benefit of our listener, whenever we talk public sector, we are talking commercial and industrial enterprises of the government. We are not talking about government administration, we are not talking about defense. Let me make it clear that when we talk public sector, it has three aspects. One is defense, second is government administration, and third is commercial and industrial undertaking of the government. Our discussion is mainly confined to the performance of the public sector enterprises. Here I am talking government as an entrepreneur. So when government is an entrepreneur, some people today think that there should be profit. But as the experts have pointed out, government cannot behave in the same way. So the point here is how to reform the functioning or working of the public sector enterprises. Professor Dutt and then Professor Hazila.
No, Firstly, I would like to say, while comparing the public sector and the private sector only by the criterion of profit.
No, I'm not talking only by the criterion of commercial profit.
Yes,
the question is, you please suggest what should be the way.
I would like to first say that we should also take certain things into cognizance. For instance, the public sector enterprises, they have to adhere to certain social norms in the payment of wages, salaries, perks, then gratuity, pensions. All these things are very much
Even government as an ideal employer.
Ideal employer. The result is that due to these factors, there is bound to be a rise in the wage cost. This is one thing, and to some extent we have to give some allowance while comparing that differences in wage costs are bound to be there between public and the private sector. Private sector is not so generous and it is not looking after. For instance, in government sector, housing may be taken much greater and all the costs may be therefore there. Secondly, the work ethics of the employees in the public sector has been geared to what I call as the seniority principle. And as a result of it, lot of harm is being done because there is no way of promoting public sector employees but on the basis of seniority. And efficiency considerations are put the least. Although in theory I have been in the university and I have experienced this. Although we go on saying, well, seniority come merit, but the trade union pressure is so strong that seniority becomes the most dominant criterion. And in actual practice, it is the seniority which counts. I have been jocularly saying that in the public sector, horse, donkey and mule, they are all standing in a queue. And when the turn of the horse comes, he is in the chair. And when that of the donkey comes, then he is in the chair. It is just a matter of accident that sometimes the few horses and few donkeys are there. So the whole thing goes on.
To improve the working of public sector enterprises?
I'll make one suggestion, though that looks very cheeky and ambitious. You see, you have to create an ethos in which workers in the public sector realize that since the public sector works in their interest, even more than the private sector does,
they must contribute.
They must put their shoulders to the wheel. In fact, when I was making a study of labor restructuring earlier in this, at the IIPA, I had occasion to talk to some of the labor leaders, leftists, ultra-leftists and others, and I asked one question from them. I said, today the public sector is now under siege. Who is responsible for this? Your workers don't want the public sector to be disbanded, but they don't want to work for the public sector also. This is very unfortunate. What kind of a political ethos have you created in this country? That in spite of being in favor of the public sector, you are creating a labor ethos which is anti-public sector. So it's a political question. And I think we can go on hammering the point that if you desire the public sector to remain in the larger interests of the people and particularly labor and working classes, then you have to develop the political attitude which helps in the expansion of the public sector. In this connection, as Dr. Rudir very rightly pointed out, and you are also referring to, employment consideration is important for the public sector. In fact, if you look at the figures, throughout the period, the largest rate of growth of the employment in India has been in the public sector rather than the private sector. And today the public sector employment is growing hardly at the rate of about 0.32% per annum, which is ridiculously low, whereas earlier in the 80s it was 2.1% to 2% per annum. So if you just wash your hands off the labor force, then in my opinion the future of labor force in this country is very bleak indeed. So it is in the labor force interest that it creates an ethos which is pro-public sector. And a third point I'll make just in a minute.
Please.
No abiding improvement in productivity and efficiency is possible unless you will spend more money on research, innovation, and so on. Now, the public sector is in a position to do it, even the private sector is not doing it even now. You know the total expenditure which the private sector is incurring in research and innovation. So, even from this point of view, the public sector is an advantage, and this advantage must be clinched.
The public sector is spending 90% of the R&D expenditure. Only 10% is done by the private sector. That goes to the advantage of the public sector. Now, one point which I want to highlight, taking the discussion further from Professor Hajela, is that the promotion policies in the public sector need to be given a shaking. And merit should be brought as a criterion. And some criteria should be developed. The banks have developed it, some of the banks, and they are trying to promote on the basis of efficiency considerations, merit-based.
Now, we have come to the conclusion that there should be change in work ethos, work culture in the public sector enterprises, and that seems to be the remedy for improving the working of public sector enterprises in India, if that is changed. But that is a big if, because in this context the experts also talked about the unionization, and that is unionization of organized labor. We all know whenever some changes are introduced, it is the labor itself which opposes any improvement in any organization today. The question is how to bring the change in work culture is the moot question today.